Hey guys, it's Miss DeMeglio here, and today we're on our third ecology video, and we're talking about biodiversity. And I know we talked about biodiversity when we first started our ecology unit, but in this video we're going to talk about it in a little bit greater detail. So our key objectives today are to define biodiversity, to explain the significance of biodiversity, to explain the importance of maintaining biodiversity, and to describe the major threats to biodiversity. So let's get started. On our very first day of our ecology unit, we defined biodiversity as the variety of life. So bio meaning life and diversity meaning variety. So variety of life, and basically what that means is there's a lot of different types of organisms on Earth. So if you're just looking at this picture, we have a lobster, we have a clam, we have a giraffe, a rhino, a palm tree. We have all of these different types of animals and organisms all on Earth. So scientists want to study this in a little bit greater detail. And there's many ways to study this. So you can study the Earth itself. So that's the biggest branch that you can study, the entire Earth. But that's really, really broad. So many scientists will look at a specific ecosystem themselves to sort of make it easier to study and understand rather than looking at the whole entire Earth. There's different types of biodiversity, and the most common to study is called species diversity. And what species diversity is, it's just the amount of species in a given area. So if there's more species in a given area, you're more diverse. If there's less species in a given area, you're less diverse. And we'll talk about more specifically what a species is in a few minutes, but species diversity is just how many different types of species are there? How many different types of organisms are there in that area? The next type of biodiversity is called genetic diversity. And what genetic diversity is, it's looking at the specific genes of one species. So it's comparing individuals in a specific species to each other. So how related are they? Are their genes the same or are they different? And the final type of biodiversity is called ecological diversity. So it's how many different ecosystems are there and how are they different from each other. So in the first two, you're kind of looking at species, and ecological diversity, you're looking at the diversity between ecosystems. So you're looking at a different level of that ecological hierarchy. So these two are focusing on species, and this one's focusing on ecosystems. So there are many different types of organisms on Earth, as I just said before. But so here we're looking at a pie chart, and it looks a bit complicated, but let's try to dissect it and dive in. So here we have vertebrates, so organisms with backbones, invertebrates, so no backbones. We have fungi, which is like a mushroom or something, plants and algae, insects, wasps, butterflies, flies, beetles. But what do we notice about this? Look how small the amount of vertebrates is in comparison to everything else. It's really interesting the amount and different types of organisms, because humans kind of like to study organisms that are similar to themselves. So we commonly as humans think about mammals and that diversity, but most of the diversity isn't in mammals. It's actually in things like insects or plants. And let's just look at this a little bit more simplistically. So roughly half of the different types of organisms on Earth, half of that diversity is all insects. And basically half of that, if you want to even get more technical, is beetles. There's so many different types of beetles. But here we're in this vertebrate category, so with a backbone, and there's not that many different types of vertebrates. There's many different types of plants and many invertebrates, but not too many of that branch that we're in. So insects and invertebrates and plants kind of dominate the world. And that also has to do with that they've been around for much, much longer than humans and other vertebrates have. So we are relatively new in evolutionary terms, whereas insects and invertebrates and plants have been here for a really long time. So they have had a very, very long time to develop that biodiversity. And I just want to reiterate this point because when I learned this in college, I was just dumbfounded. So there's 400,000 species of beetles. Think about how many different types of beetles they are, and they're extremely diverse in color, in body structure, extremely diverse. So just this one branch of organism, look at this diversity. So if you can just imagine the diversity in the earth, if just beetles have this much diversity, it's incredible. You don't really need to write anything about this, but I just think this is really cool, even if you don't like insects. So like I said before, biodiversity is often studied by species. So let's just get a working definition of species, because I know there's a lot of definitions out there, but this is the definition I want you to know, and you'll probably genuinely come across because this one's the most commonly accepted by most scientists. So a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed. So it's a group of the same organism that can breed and produce a viable offspring. So for example, humans mate with other humans and they create a human as their offspring. So you're creating the same offspring, you're both the same type of species, and you can interbreed. So when you're studying species diversity, for example, if we're looking at this ecosystem, there's many different types of species in this landscape. So we have multiple different species of birds here. We have multiple different species of reptile or amphibian. So ecologists will look at the different types of species in a landscape. So this would be species diversity. There's many different species of bird, many different species of reptile, plant, all in this one landscape. So the next question is, how do we measure how diverse something is? How can we measure biodiversity quantitatively? And one of the most common ways, especially when you're talking about species diversity, is you would look at species richness. And what species richness is the number of species in a sample or a community. So if you're looking at a sample, for example, like if you scooped out a container of soil, you would look about how many different types of species were in that soil. But usually you'll look at a specific ecosystem or a community. So how many different species are in that one space that you're looking at would be the definition of species richness. So the more species there are, the greater the species richness. The less species there are in an area, the less species richness. And this varies with location. So different ecosystems have different species richness. And that has to do with the abiotic factors there and the biotic factors there. And there are some common trends with biodiversity. So it's usually more diverse in areas that are tropical, so areas with water and areas with higher temperature. So more tropical regions usually tend to be more diverse. And tropical rainforests are the most diverse. Out of all the different types of organisms, tropical rainforests seem to be the most diverse. And that's for many different reasons, but mostly because of the abiotic and biotic factors there. And we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later throughout the course. So here I just wanted to show you how species richness can be quantified on a graph. And in this we're looking at the species richness of reptiles in the United States. And the red would be more numbers of species and the blue would be less numbers of species. And as you could see, clearly there is a trend here. So here down towards these southern states, there's much more reptiles than there are in these northern states. And that likely has to do with there's a warmer climate here. So perhaps the reptiles need warmer climate, whereas in these colder environments, they can't survive. So species richness definitely varies with location for things like climate or water source, and it depends on that type of species. So here we have another graph, but this is just looking at species richness across the entire world. So again, red means more species, the yellow means less species, and as you could see, there's definitely a trend here. So we're seeing more diversity in species in these warmer climates rather than these other areas, or in the extreme hot climates, we're seeing less species. So there's definitely a trend where the amount of species are most prevalent. And as you can see here, South America is very known for their tropical rainforests, and here is extreme diversity, as well as Africa has some rainforests as well as Australia has some rainforests, and these all have extreme diversity. And let's just review what we learned today. I'm going to have a second biodiversity video because this one went a little bit long, but this is what we went through in this video. So biodiversity is the variety of life, and it's usually studied by species. Biodiversity varies by location. Some parts of the earth have higher species richness than other parts of the earth. So that's basically what we covered in this video. Stay tuned for our next Biodiversity 2 video. Bye guys, hope you guys learned something.